ready to now tackle another aspect of optimal living, something that's very important, right? We've talked about eating right, talked a little about exercise, we've talked about mindfulness, but at the end of the day, what is it that we all need to do? We need to sleep. And so with us today, Dr. Matthew Edlund, known as the Rest Doctor. He is the Doctor of Rest, and he directs the Center for Circadian Medicine, is an internationally recognized expert on rest, sleep, biological clocks, performance, and regenerative health. His previous books include The Body Clock Advantage, Designed to Last, and Psychological Time and Mental Illness. He writes on and practices regenerative health, a new approach to medical care whose goal is complete health, physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being, which is what we've been talking about all day. Dr. Edlund trained in internal medicine at University of California, San Diego, and Massachusetts General Hospital, in occupational and public health at the Harvard School of Public Health, in sleep medicine at Brown, and in psychiatry at N.Y.U, Bellevue. He is a graduate of Amherst College, summa cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa, and from S.U.N.Y, Downstate, cum laude, and Alpha Omega Alpha. Dr. Edlund is a local AIA 10x10 alum and hence familiar with how to pack a lot of information into a short period of time. Here to help us to reconnect with our body's natural sleep rhythms, please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Edlund. Come on up. There we are.
This is what happens when you come from the left. Of course, that's not a political statement. How do I change slide?
Oh, you have a clicker right here.
All right. Yeah, I wrote a book called The Power of Rest a while back, but since that time I've really been moving from rest to regeneration and trying to make people healthy. Yeah, which is part of the misfortune of going to public health school, that basically ruins your life. So what I really want to talk about is living long and well. And that gets to the question of what's health. What are people's definitions of health? Is it a cholesterol below 130? Is it a blood pressure below 120 over 80? Is it a fasting blood glucose less than 100? I mean, what do people consider to be healthy? Any ideas?
Okay. Sorry, folks.
Anyway, there is a World Health Organization definition of health, which is actually quite wild. And what it says is complete physical, mental, and social well-being. That's what healthcare systems and public health systems are supposed to be for. That doesn't mean they are, but that's what they're supposed to be for. And the stuff that I'm writing about more recently in terms of biological intelligence, which is how your body uses and creates knowledge, is that you add spiritual well-being. This is not exactly new. Medicine's been doing this for at least a couple of millennia. Until recently, basically until you get to the 20th century, medical care doesn't do a whole lot besides give you opiates and socially support you through bad illnesses. But social and spiritual well-being are very large parts of what keep people surviving. And what's my definition of spiritual? Something that connects you with something larger than oneself. That could be family, that could be community, that could be animals, that could be a lot of different things. Okay. So, in terms of these definitions of health, you see a lot of things on the net, you see a lot of things that's sent to you in the newspaper. Wouldn't it be nice if, we can live this much longer if we do X, Y, and Z? So my question to you is, what would you do to live 12 to 14 years longer? What kinds of things would you do? No answers? Exercise, okay, we'll get to that. But basically, if somebody had a pill and they said, okay, we could take the average person in the population, the average male, 12 years, the average female, 14 years, we can extend their lifespan that long, what would people pay for it? A couple of bucks? 30,000 a year? Okay, that's one start. I'll tell that to the concierge doctors. Maybe they'll make a deal with you. But if you actually look, there are data on this kind of stuff. It's a lot of data. And this was a study that was done by Mayor Stanford and a bunch of other people I knew back in the 1980s. This is part of long-term population studies that have been done out of the Harvard School of Public Health. And they were looking at 123,000 people, which is a reasonable size. And they were basically saying, if you did X, Y, and Z, not take this pill, but if you do X, Y, and Z, chances are you're going to live a good deal longer. And in their study, by these lifestyle determinations, there was an 82% reduction in cardiovascular disease and 65% in cancer. Where are you going to get that? You're going to get that from drugs? You're going to get that from elements of our wonderful healthcare system? The finest, most exceptional in the world? No, you're not. And in fact, if you look at the American medical care system, if it adds 2 or 3 years lifetime, it's a lot. Okay, so these were what people needed to do. They had to have a body mass index below 25. Unfortunately, 70% of the population who are adult don't have that. That has to do with a lot of things involving food companies and how we live and what we eat, though I won't discuss anything in terms of lunch. Next, you have to walk 25, 30 minutes a day or do some kind of physical activity. And that can include housework, that can include yard work. Yes, you eat lots of fruits and vegetables, you don't smoke, you don't drink much. I have a bunch of articles out on that. There's some recent data on alcohol, which are actually not that good. Okay, but these are the 5 healthy habits. And they're not particularly complicated conceptually, all right? Basically, your weight's semi-controlled, you move around a fair bit, you eat whole foods, and you don't smoke, okay? What percentage of Americans fulfill these requirements? Any ideas?
2.5%.
2.5, that's pretty close. Yeah. Any other numbers? It's a grand 2%. Okay? And that's been shown in a whole bunch of studies that go back 30, 40 years. Okay? One of the arguments I'm going to be making to you is that your body is smart, you can make it smarter, and you do it by what you do, because what you do is what you become. And if you will look over a long series of public health studies over many years, you will basically find that the number of people who fulfill what seem to be not complicated criteria is a grand 2%. So, I'm going to get to a subject that's a little closer to my heart, which is biological intelligence. Okay, who here is concerned about artificial intelligence? Okay, there's a few people. Right, the artificial intelligence, which is allowing everything, not only you tracked on your cell phone in terms of where you go, but what your habits are, what you're interested in, and supposedly what books you want to buy, what foods you want to eat, where you want to travel. In other words, what do the databases know more than you do? If you look at the Cambridge Analytica stuff that has come out in terms of recent political turmoil in the United States, they estimated they had 5,000 to 6,000 different data points on every individual. Okay? Now, how many do we have? A heck of a lot more. Biological intelligence is a much, much bigger thing than artificial intelligence. And basically, this is how your body operates. This is its operating system. And it has several advantages over AI. For one thing, it's been around for 3.6 billion years. And evolution, believe me, is a naive teacher. So this survives earthquakes, it survives plagues, it survives volcanoes, pestilence, starvation, and war. And one of the reasons our population is so big is we basically have a body that's built for starvation, for recurrent starvation. That's been human history for a very, very long time. And a large part of the human population more or less disappeared 70, 75,000 years ago. And we really are built to survive starvation quite well, which means we'll scarf up every calorie we can. Then you look at what really goes on in terms of biological intelligence, which is that it includes all kinds of conscious and unconscious information. Okay, when we go outside, I was walking over from the library to here, it's one of my favorite places to park downtown, and as I'm going by, I'm not actually querying what cold viruses are out there, what hepatitis viruses are out there, what pollutants are out there. But my immune system is, and very often it's producing not millions, but billions of different immunoglobulins to see which ones stick and see which ones deal with it. Your information system is vast, and mostly it is not conscious, okay? We are learning all the time. We learn in our sleep. We will, if you look, and I'll go back to being a sleep doc for a minute, if you actually look at what happens in sleep, you will take the fat synapses that have been built up between nerve cells And they will be thinner by the end of the day, I'm sorry, by the end of the night, because you have literally reorganized your brain every night you're asleep. We are constantly remaking our information. We are constantly remaking our data. That's why we survive. We are constantly updating. Okay, now, most of that is not conscious. If you really think about most of the thoughts you have, you'll see that it takes quite a lot of effort to get those things into a conscious state. Do we think about our immune system knocking off tumor cells all day? No. Do we think about when we go to drive, do we say to ourselves, okay, I'm going to take the steering wheel in my right hand and turn it at 22.5 degrees to the right? No, we just do it. Most of the information that we process in our brains and our bodies is processed unconsciously. That's why we haven't paid attention to this whole subject. Okay. Now, what are some of the other goals of biological intelligence? Basically, it's survival of the species, not so much the individual. We have a lot of illnesses in us that are genetic. They don't seem to be for any particular use. I mean, why do people have sickle cell? Actually, there you have the example of malaria. Why do people have Tay-Sachs disease? Why do people have cystic fibrosis? There is something about that genetic variety that makes us capable of surviving almost everything that's thrown at us. Okay? We are built to survive as a species, and we've survived, despite our best efforts, for several million years. And within that is an extraordinarily large capacity to adapt. Because another thing about biological intelligence is it's based on contingency and chance. It's not the machine learning that you're going to get from an AI system. Chance rules the world. A large part of what we do in our lives is controlled by chance. Who we marry, what kinds of jobs we end up in, what sort of cities we live in. A lot of this is based on chance. The trick is to use chance. The trick is to give yourself those good chances, which usually means low probability but high impact if you want to have a good result. So as I was saying before, we're constantly re-updating our body in all kinds of ways, most of which we're not conscious of. And this is a huge ecosystem that we're operating on. Okay, how many cells are there in the human body? How many human cells are there in the human body? Any ideas? Millions. There's actually trillions. It's like budget deficits. You just have to keep on adding zeros. So there's actually about 10 trillion human cells. How many bacterial cells are there in your gut? It used to be thought it was 100, but it's been downgraded to 40. Okay. And there's at least 10,000 basic species and subspecies varieties down there, which we have adopted to and they have adopted to us over many millions of years. If you look at human DNA, a vast proportion of it is related to virus and bacterial stuff. We have been interacting with them forever. So there's 40 trillion bacteria in your gut. There's unbelievable numbers of viruses. There's Rickettsia, there's mycoplasma. We are a functioning ecosystem, and that ecosystem is a very large part of us. It not only changes our immunity, but it can even change things like mood. You can look at things like toxoplasmosis, cysts in people, and then you can, to some extent, predict their suicide rate. These things are part of us, and we don't think about it. As I say, this is what biological intelligence is about. There's this vast information system interacting all the time that we have not been conscious of, and in many cases have not studied. Okay, so how do you make the body smarter? You can look at the same kinds of things the World Health Organization talks about. You can look at the 4 pillars of health, some people call it the 4 paths. You can look at physical activity, and that is literally active rest. The idea that rest is sitting in a chair and, quote, doing nothing is not correct. Your body, even in, quote, resting states, even when it's physically not moving, is still regenerating, still rebuilding, still renewing. Rest is a much bigger topic than sleep. Then there's mental well-being, which is basically training the brain to think in terms of solutions as opposed to problems. There's social well-being, which is nice to see a bunch of people here. That's a very underrated part of health. I try to tell cardiologists that the number of friends you have, colleagues and acquaintances, is a much bigger factor in your cardiovascular survival than anything they will do, and they usually either walk away or laugh at me. The problem is, those are the numbers. Spiritual well-being is now getting recognized more and more. Basically, when people feel connected to something larger than themselves, when they are pulled into the future, their general health tends to be very effective. Now, the goof is you can do all 4 of these things for any diagnosis that you have. It could be for a cold, it could be for cancer, it could be for blood pressure. You can actually utilize all 4 of these arenas most of the time for any diagnosis of ill. Okay, and I'll just give you one simple example. This is a patient of mine, fairly typical. Since I trained originally in internal medicine, public health, psychiatry, and then sleep, I tend to have a fairly diverse group of patients. So here's a woman who had sleep apnea, mood swings up and down like crazy, partly due to the medications that she was on, which also tended to provoke her sleep apnea. She was diabetic, she was obese, and she was pretty miserable and didn't want to do anything, including getting out of bed. So I basically argued with her in terms of 4, let's go back to that, 4 different things, which was what could you do physically? I basically wanted her to walk around and move, even when she didn't want to. I tried to get her to go to bed and get up at relatively regular times. I worked real hard at getting her to get light therapy. This is something that's abundant in Sarasota and is extraordinarily useful. Light is a drug. It changes your immunity, it changes your mood, it will change a lot of different things, and morning light tends to be more effective than evening light. That's just the way we're built. Dawn light has the biggest effect. In terms of cognitive therapy, I'll get that in the next slide. Her sleep pattern really was completely messed up. Once it was organized a bit, things got better. Then she got, in this case, she got a dog. That made a huge difference as well, because the dog would get her out of bed. I have a chapter in one of my books on basically why dogs are helpful to people. But she got a whole lot better. She had hated the idea of taking anything like antidepressants. They came into the picture much later. But basically, she got a whole lot better by doing natural things. One of the natural things, even though it's not intuitive to most people, is versions of cognitive behavioral therapy. How many people here have done CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy? 1, 3, okay, not a huge number. CBT can be relatively simple, and it's basically looking at the world in terms of solutions as opposed to problems. Writing down simple things like, okay, I'm bored to death by this lecture, what can I do to get through the next 10 minutes? Or I weigh too much, what can I do to make myself feel healthier? And in very short bits, you do it, you can do it in the evening, you can do it at night, you can do it in the morning, but if you do 3 or 4 minutes of this each day and then you look at it, and look at it from the standpoint the next day, I tried plan A, that didn't work. I tried plan B, that didn't work. What's plan C, what's plan D? You basically change your brain to think relentlessly in terms of solutions. This is how the military operates, okay? And the situation is not what should have been, not what ought to have been, not what could have been, but what do I do now? How do I make things better? How do I train my brain to think what's the next best solution I can come up with? That's not something that most of us do. We usually look back and say, oh, this shouldn't have happened, or, you know, so-and-so hadn't given me that bump rap 15 years ago, I never would have been in this situation. No, the issue is, what can we do now? And once you start doing this kind of stuff, it will generalize across life. People are usually quite good at doing this at work, but they have a much harder time doing it for themselves. Okay, now in terms of just making people healthy, I try to walk all over the place. It gets me in trouble. But there's a group called Smart Growth America. They look at overall pedestrian deaths related to how much people are working in the population. And they looked at 104 municipalities. This was done in 2016. And yes, Sarasota did make it into the top 10. We were number 10. This is a great place to die as a pedestrian. Trust me on this. I've written bunches of articles on this. I walk across 41 most days 6 times. And this is a place where pedestrians are sometimes viewed as a really interesting form of roadkill. Now, we're not alone. Of the top 10 cities in America, 8 were in Florida. So this is clearly a cultural thing, not just related to age and how things are set up. Tampa was number 7, Cape Coral was number 1. So we have real competition. But basically, a healthy environment is part of what we're talking about. If you want people to be healthy, you want to be able to let them move around. There's a lot of British studies showing that when people have green space around them, they can walk, they can talk, they can socialize, that overall, for example, overall heart attack rates go down 30 to 50%. This is real stuff. And a healthy economy requires a healthy population, and a healthy population requires a healthy environment. Those are critical things. They're critical things in terms of our political and social future, and they have to be considered for what they are. They're part of health. They're part of our overall survival. Okay. Now, interestingly, if you look at biological intelligence, even if you just think of yourself as having a body that's smart, you can potentially make it smarter. There was a study that was done, this is 5-6 years ago, where they looked at basically hotel housekeepers in Boston, most of whom were Latino women. And one group, they said, what you're doing is really healthy, keep it up, your job involves a lot of physical activity, that's good. The other group, they said, what you're doing fulfills the Surgeon General's reports on what's considered to be healthy exercise. Okay, so they were told different things, doing the same job. What do you think happened a year later? Okay. What basically happened is the group that was told that what they were doing was fulfilling the Surgeon General's requirements in terms of physical activity had considerably lower weights and lower cholesterol. Intentionality matters. If you think things can happen, they very often will. If you just think of your body as smarter, if you just think of your body as something that is intelligent, if you think of it as something that can be made smarter, it will tend to go in that direction. Okay? Health is learned. We don't think that way. We don't think of health as an education, because most of the education, as I say, is going to occur through lifestyle, through what you do. It's not the kind of thing you do in a book. But it's still learning. It's still processing. It's still changing the information. Okay? Because what you do is what you become. And if you can just think in your own daily life in terms of, what am I doing vis-a-vis physical activity? What am I doing in terms of mental activity? In physical activity, it's conceptually not complicated. It's basically, do you walk around? Do you do physical things around the house? Do you walk upstairs if you can? If you can't use your legs, use your arms. All muscles count. Speech, not so much, but most muscles count. In terms of sleep, the basic game is relatively simple. Go to bed, get up at the same time each day. Do it in a cool, comfortable environment. Try to have not too much noise, but basically have a ritual before you do it of calming the brain. You can read my books, they usually put people to sleep. You can read all those books you should have read in high school but didn't. You can listen to 16th century music. You can listen to talking books, which really knock people out. But there's a lot of different things that people can do to make rest more functional. Mentally, you want to think of the world in terms of solutions as opposed to problems. Things are going to screw up. They always screw up. That's the way the world is. The trick is to have a mind that thinks, what can I do to make it better? As far as social things are concerned, basically the more social connections you have that are real, I'm not so sure about internet connections so far. Some things positive, some things negative. But basically face-to-face connections, the more of them that people have, the less heart attacks, the less strokes, in many cases less tumors. Basically the longer you live. And in terms of the last component, the spiritual component, do something that pulls you into the future. Do something that fills you with something larger than your own self. Something that actually helps the people around you, because that's going to end up helping you. Okay, now if you want more on this kind of stuff, if you really can't sleep, you go to therestdoctor.com, which is one of my websites. I think there's about 570 articles in the archive, so there's plenty of sleep-inducing material there. Also, if you really want to have an idea of what this talk is like, if you just click down to the video, I think you have to read the first few lines, and then click down to the video. That's a 5-minute version of what I've been talking about here. So basically, health is learned, your body is smart, you can make it smarter, what you do is what you become. Thank you.